Have you ever noticed that the people who leave you feeling the most uncertain are often the ones you struggle the hardest to let go of? At first, everything seemed effortless. Conversations stretched late into the night. Their attention felt warm, almost magnetic. For a while, it seemed like the beginning of something real. Then, almost without warning, something shifted. Replies became slower. Plans turned uncertain. The person who once seemed eager to know you suddenly felt difficult to reach. You found yourself rereading old conversations, wondering if you had imagined the connection that had felt so genuine only weeks before. Strangely, when they finally came back, the relief was almost overwhelming. For a moment, the uncertainty disappeared, and it felt as if everything was back on track until the distance returned again. If you've lived through this pattern more than once, you may have started asking yourself a painful question. Why do I keep falling for emotionally unavailable people? It's tempting to answer that question with self-criticism. Maybe you ignore obvious warning signs. Maybe you're drawn to people who are difficult to love, or perhaps you're simply afraid of healthy relationships. These explanations are common, but they rarely tell the whole story. Psychology offers a quieter possibility. What if your attraction isn't really to emotional distance? What if your brain has learned to experience emotional unpredictability as something strangely familiar? Because before your conscious mind begins weighing compatibility, your nervous system has already started comparing this relationship to emotional patterns it learned years ago, not because it wants you to suffer, but because the human brain is built to recognize what it already knows. And here's the paradox. Familiarity and emotional safety are not the same thing, yet our minds often confuse one for the other. So perhaps the real question isn't why you keep choosing emotionally unavailable people. The people who confuse us the most often aren't completely unavailable. They're available just enough to keep hope alive. Perhaps it's this. Why does emotional distance feel so familiar in the first place? To answer that, we have to go back to where your emotional compass was first calibrated. Every compass points somewhere. The question isn't whether yours works. It's who calibrated it. And that story begins long before your first relationship. If emotional distance feels strangely familiar, the next question is obvious. Where did that familiarity come from? Relationship psychology suggests that our earliest experiences don't simply shape what we remember. They shape what our nervous system expects. As children, we rely on caregivers, not only for food and protection, but also for emotional regulation. Through thousands of everyday interactions, the brain begins asking quiet but important questions. When I need comfort, does someone come? When I express emotion, am I understood, ignored, or criticized? Is closeness something I can trust, or something I have to earn? Over time, these experiences become an internal blueprint, not a conscious set of rules, but an emotional map that quietly influences how relationships feel. For some people, affection was steady and predictable. Their nervous system gradually learned that intimacy could be calm, consistent, and safe. For others, connection felt less certain. Love might have been warm one day and distant the next. Praise arrived unpredictably. Affection sometimes depended on good behavior, emotional self-control, or meeting unspoken expectations. Even in caring families, stress, illness, work demands, or unresolved struggles could make emotional availability inconsistent. The child doesn't analyze these experiences. The child's brain adapts to them. From a survival perspective, adaptation is remarkably intelligent. When attention is inconsistent, the brain becomes highly sensitive. to signs that connection might disappear. It learns to monitor small changes in tone, expression, or distance, because staying emotionally connected once felt important for safety. Those adaptations can remain long after childhood has passed. The people who feel the most emotionally familiar aren't always the people who are most emotionally available. Sometimes they're the people who unknowingly activate patterns your brain learned long before you knew what love was. Years later, when someone is warm one moment and distant the next, your conscious mind may feel confused, but your nervous system may experience something else entirely. Not certainty, not happiness, recognition. And that recognition can be mistaken for chemistry, even when the relationship leaves you feeling anxious, far more often than secure. Understanding that difference changes the question once again. Perhaps attraction isn't always about finding what is healthiest. Sometimes it's about finding what your emotional blueprint already knows. If emotional familiarity can shape attraction, another question naturally follows. Why does it feel so powerful? After all, if these relationships often leave us anxious, why don't we simply walk away? Part of the answer lies in the way the brain responds to uncertainty. Our brains are constantly trying to predict what will happen next. Predictability helps us feel safe because it reduces the need to stay on alert. But when someone's affection is inconsistent, that prediction becomes much harder to make. One day, they're affectionate. The next, they're distant. Then, just as you're beginning to let go, they reconnect. Each return feels meaningful, not only because of the person, but because the uncertainty has finally ended, at least for a moment. Psychologists have long observed that unpredictable rewards can be especially compelling. This principle, known as intermittent reinforcement, has been studied in learning and behavior for decades. When positive experiences arrive inconsistently rather than predictably, the brain often pays even closer attention, continuing to search for the next moment of connection. Your emotional compass isn't pointing toward pain. It's pointing toward what it has learned to recognize in relationships. This can create a painful illusion. The relief you feel when someone becomes emotionally available again can be mistaken for proof that the relationship is becoming stronger. But relief and security are not the same emotion. Relief is the feeling that uncertainty has briefly stopped. Security is the confidence that closeness doesn't have to be earned over and over again. That distinction is easy to miss because both emotions can feel warm in the moment. This is why many people describe an emotionally available partner as boring at first, not because stability lacks depth, but because a nervous system accustomed to unpredictability may mistake calm for the absence of chemistry. Real intimacy often feels quieter than the stories we've learned to associate with love. It leaves less room for constant guessing, less room for emotional chasing, and more room for simply being known. Perhaps genuine connection isn't the emotional roller coaster we've been taught to expect. Perhaps it feels more like coming home to a place where you no longer have to wonder whether the door will still be open tomorrow. If your emotional compass was shaped by experience, then one question remains. Can it be recalibrated? Research on the brain suggests that our emotional patterns are remarkably persistent, but they are not fixed. Throughout life, the nervous system continues updating its expectations based on new experiences. Psychologists sometimes describe this as corrective emotional experience, moments that gently challenge what we've come to expect from relationships. That rarely happens all at once. More often, it happens in ordinary moments. When someone says they'll call, and they do. When a disagreement doesn't end in withdrawal. When your feelings are met with curiosity instead of dismissal. At first, these moments can feel surprisingly unremarkable, not because they lack meaning, but because your brain has little practice recognizing consistency as something important. Over time, however, repetition begins to matter. The nervous system slowly learns that closeness doesn't always have to be followed by distance, that honesty doesn't automatically lead to rejection, that being understood can become familiar instead of unexpected. This isn't about forcing yourself to choose different people overnight. It's about giving your emotional compass enough new experiences that it gradually discovers another direction. And once that begins to happen, the question is no longer whether you can feel attracted to something healthier. It's whether your definition of love has quietly started to change. Maybe that's the quiet truth hidden beneath this entire pattern. You were never simply choosing the wrong people. You were following an emotional compass that had been calibrated long before you understood what love was. That doesn't mean every emotionally unavailable relationship has the same cause. Human relationships are always more complicated than a single explanation. But for many people, understanding this pattern replaces a painful question with a more compassionate one. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what has my nervous system learned to expect? Sometimes, that single shift changes everything. Because once you stop treating your reactions as proof of who you are, you can begin seeing them as experiences that shaped you, not sentences that define you. A compass isn't broken because it once pointed in the wrong direction. It simply responds to the information it has. And when the information changes, so can the direction. Perhaps that's what healing really looks like. Not becoming a different person. Not pretending painful experiences never happened. But allowing your nervous system to discover that love doesn't always arrive with uncertainty. That closeness doesn't have to be earned. That silence doesn't always mean someone is leaving. Perhaps that's why healthy love can feel unfamiliar at first. Not because something is missing, but because something is no longer demanding your constant attention. There is less guessing, less chasing, less wondering whether today's warmth will disappear tomorrow. The relationship may feel quieter, not because it lacks depth, but because your nervous system is finally beginning to rest. Maybe we spent so long confusing emotional intensity with emotional intimacy that peace can almost feel unfamiliar. Yet intimacy isn't measured by how often someone makes you question where you stand. It's measured by how safe you feel, standing exactly where you are. A compass doesn't choose its direction. It simply follows the reference point it has been given. And for a long time, your heart may have believed uncertainty was north. But a compass can be recalibrated. Slowly, quietly. One experience of honesty at a time. One experience of consistency at a time. One relationship that asks you to be yourself, instead of asking you to earn your place. So perhaps, the next time someone makes your heart race, don't ask only, do I want this person? Ask something even quieter. Does this feel like love? Or does it simply feel familiar? Because sometimes, the most important relationship you'll ever change isn't the one you're chasing. It's the one between your heart and the direction it calls home.